The nurse handed me the folded blanket meant for a stranger's baby, and that was the exact moment I understood my husband had built an entire secret family with my own sister, only 3 miles from the house where I still ironed his shirts every Sunday morning. Before I tell you what happened next, and before your heart breaks the way mine did that afternoon, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet kind of hope that survives even the worst betrayals, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to sit with a story instead of scrolling past it, and I promise you, this one is worth staying for. My name is Vivian, and for 11 years I believed I understood the shape of my own life. I grew up in a small town where the summers smelled like cut grass and the church bell rang at noon whether anyone was listening or not. I was the responsible one, the one who got good grades and never made a scene, while my younger sister Isabel was the golden one, the one who lit up every room she walked into, the one people forgave before she'd even finished apologizing. Our mother used to say that Isabel was born laughing and I was born thinking, and for most of my childhood I didn't mind that division of labor. I loved my sister. I want you to understand that clearly before anything else, because what I'm about to tell you will make it hard to believe, but I loved her the way you love someone whose face you've known since before you had memories of your own. I met Gregory Cole when I was 24, at a friend's engagement dinner where he'd been seated across from me because the hosts thought we'd get along. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than shy, the kind of quiet that made you want to know what was going on behind his eyes. He worked in structural engineering, which meant he spent his days making sure buildings didn't fall down, and there was something about that steadiness that appealed to me immediately. He asked good questions. He remembered small details from earlier in a conversation and brought them back up hours later, which made me feel like I was being truly listened to for the first time in my adult life. We married 2 years later in a garden behind his mother's house, under a sky so blue it looked painted, and Isabel stood beside me as my maid of honor, crying harder than I did during the vows. For the first several years, our marriage was ordinary in the best sense of that word. We bought a small house with a crooked mailbox that Gregory kept promising to fix and never did. We argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes and made up within the hour. We talked about children the way young couples do, with a mixture of excitement and vague terror, imagining a future that felt both certain and impossibly far away. What we didn't know, what I didn't know, was that my body would make that future far more complicated than either of us expected. After 3 years of trying, then 2 years of appointments and tests and a vocabulary I never wanted to learn, words like unexplained infertility and diminished ovarian reserve, we were told that our chances of conceiving naturally were slim, and that even with intervention, there were no guarantees. I don't think people who haven't lived through that particular grief understand how it hollows you out. It isn't a single loss you can point to and mourn properly. It's a slow leak, a monthly disappointment that never quite becomes numb no matter how many times you brace yourself for it. Gregory was patient with me during those years, or at least I believed he was. He held me on the nights I cried in the bathroom with the fan running so the sound wouldn't carry. He sat beside me in waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and forced optimism. He told me, more than once, that he'd rather have a life with me and no children than children with anyone else. I believed him completely. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think back on it now, how completely I believed him. Isabel, meanwhile, had drifted through a series of relationships that never quite settled into anything permanent. She was 29 by then, working as a floral designer for events around the city, arranging peonies and eucalyptus into arrangements that made brides cry with joy on their wedding mornings. She would come over for Sunday dinners, bringing wine and gossip and an energy that filled up whatever room she entered. She and Gregory got along well, the easy way siblings-in-law sometimes do, teasing each other about sports teams and trading recommendations for restaurants neither of them could really afford. I never once, not for a single moment, imagined there was anything beneath that easy friendship. I want to be honest with you and say that this wasn't naivety on my part. I simply trusted the two people I loved most in the world, and trust, once it's given fully, doesn't leave room for suspicion to take root. The unraveling began so quietly that I almost missed it. Gregory started working later, which I attributed to a demanding new project at his firm, a bridge retrofit that he talked about with the kind of technical enthusiasm that used to make me smile even when I didn't understand half of what he was saying. Isabel became harder to reach, her calls shorter, her visits less frequent, which I attributed to a new boyfriend she mentioned only in passing, someone she described as not serious, just fun. Looking back, I can see now that both of them were pulling away from me in tandem, orbiting closer to each other while drifting further from the center I thought I occupied in both their lives. But grief and hope have a way of narrowing your vision. I was still deep in the exhausting cycle of fertility treatments, my body full of hormones that made me weep at commercials and snap at small inconveniences, and I simply didn't have the bandwidth to notice what should have been obvious. The truth arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early spring, delivered not through some dramatic confrontation but through the mundane accident of a wrong hospital notification. I had gone in for a routine follow-up appointment related to my own treatment, sitting in the same waiting room I'd sat in dozens of times before, when a nurse approached me with a folded blue blanket and a clipboard, asking if I was there to pick up materials for Isabel Hastings' upcoming delivery. I told her she must have the wrong person, that my sister wasn't pregnant, that there had to be some mistake. The nurse checked her clipboard again, apologized for the confusion, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the father listed on the intake form was a Gregory Cole, and that the pregnancy was progressing well for twins. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking to my car. I remember sitting in the driver's seat for what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour, staring at the crooked mailbox of a memory that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I remember the strange, clinical calm that settled over me, the kind of calm that arrives right before everything shatters, as though your mind is trying to protect you by slowing down time itself. I did not call Gregory. I did not call Isabel. I drove home, sat at our kitchen table, and waited. When Gregory came home that evening, I asked him directly, without preamble, whether he had gotten my sister pregnant. I watched something collapse behind his eyes, and in that collapse I had my answer before he ever opened his mouth. He didn't deny it. I think some small, cowardly part of me had hoped he would deny it, would laugh it off as an absurd mistake, would give me some thread of doubt to hold on to. Instead, he sat down heavily across from me and began to explain, as though an explanation could possibly matter at that point, how it had started as comfort during a difficult time, how one evening of vulnerability had become another, how he had told himself it meant nothing until it became something he could no longer control or deny. He said he was sorry more times than I could count, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even in the middle of that devastation, that sorry was the cheapest word in the English language, offered freely precisely because it cost the speaker nothing and repaired nothing. I did not scream. I did not throw anything, though God knows I wanted to. I sat very still, my hands flat on the table, and I asked him to leave the house that night. He tried to argue, tried to explain that we needed to talk this through, that 11 years of marriage deserved more than a single conversation, and in a different version of this story maybe he would have been right. But something in me had already made its decision, some deep and ancient part of my spirit that understood betrayal of this magnitude could not be negotiated with, only survived. I told him that whatever conversation needed to happen could happen through lawyers. He left. I did not cry until I heard his car pull out of the driveway, and then I cried in a way I had never cried before, not even during the darkest months of infertility treatment, a grief that felt like it was rearranging my organs. Isabel called me the next morning, and I let it ring until it stopped. She called again an hour later, and then again, until finally I answered simply to make the ringing stop. Her voice was thick with tears, and she kept saying my name, Vivian, Vivian, please, as though repetition alone could undo what had been done. I asked her one question, the only question that mattered to me in that moment. I asked her how long. She was quiet for a long time before she answered, and when she did, the number she gave me, nearly 2 years, landed like a physical blow. 2 years of Sunday dinners where she'd sat across from me trading jokes with my husband. 2 years of phone calls where she'd asked about my fertility treatments with what I now understood must have been either genuine cruelty or a guilt so profound she couldn't face it directly. I told her I never wanted to speak to her again, and I meant it with every fiber of my being, though I would later learn that certainty, like most things in this life, is rarely as permanent as it feels in the moment we declare it. The months that followed the divorce filing were the hardest of my life, harder even than the years of fertility struggles, because at least in those years I had believed I was fighting alongside someone who loved me. Now I was fighting alone, navigating lawyers and paperwork and the particular humiliation of watching my small town discover, through the efficient machinery of gossip, exactly what had happened to my marriage. I moved out of the house with the crooked mailbox and into a rented apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread each morning became, strangely, one of the only things that made me feel human during those early weeks. My mother, caught in an impossible position between her two daughters, tried at first to broker some kind of peace, until I made it clear that any attempt at reconciliation on Isabel's behalf would end our relationship as well. She backed away then, grieving in her own quiet way for the family that had fractured in a single Tuesday afternoon. Gregory's mother, Eleanor Cole, was a woman I had always respected, even admired, in the particular way you admire a mother-in-law who never quite becomes a friend but never becomes an enemy either. She was in her early 70s, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, a retired hospital administrator who had raised Gregory largely on her own after his father died young. In the initial weeks after the truth came out, Eleanor did something I hadn't expected. She called me, not to defend her son, but to apologize on his behalf, her voice shaking with a fury I hadn't known she possessed. She told me she was ashamed, that she had raised him better than this, and that whatever happened between us, she wanted me to know I would always be welcome in her home if I ever needed anything. I thanked her, though at the time I couldn't imagine ever wanting anything from that family again. Grief has a way of making forever feel like the only possible tense. I threw myself into work during those months, taking on more shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse in the maternity ward, a job whose daily irony was not lost on me, spending my working hours helping other families welcome new life while my own capacity for that experience had been declared, medically and now personally, over. There is a particular kind of strength that grief forces out of you, not the dramatic strength of movies, but the quiet, grinding strength of getting up each morning and doing your job well even when your chest feels hollow. I became, in those months, someone I almost didn't recognize, thinner, quieter, but also, in some ways I couldn't yet articulate, more solid. Betrayal strips away everything false in your life and leaves you standing in front of the truth of who you actually are. What I found standing there, to my own surprise, was someone capable of surviving far more than I had ever given myself credit for. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that Tuesday afternoon in the waiting room. I did not attend the final signing in person. My lawyer handled it while I worked a double shift, delivering 3 babies into the world on the same day my marriage legally ended, a coincidence so strange I still think about it sometimes when I can't sleep. Gregory moved into an apartment closer to Isabel, and though I heard through the same efficient gossip machinery that they had not yet married, everyone understood the shape of the family that was forming in the wreckage of the one I had lost. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself this many times, with the kind of forced conviction that usually means the opposite is true. It was nearly 6 months after the divorce, in the full bloom of early summer, when I received a phone call at the hospital that would upend everything I thought I understood about this story, including my own place within it. I was finishing a 12-hour shift, exhausted in the specific way that only maternity nurses understand, when the head of obstetrics pulled me aside and told me, with the careful gentleness reserved for delivering difficult news, that Isabel Hastings had been admitted for an emergency delivery, 6 weeks early, and that there were complications. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because this story means nothing if I'm not honest. Part of me, a small, wounded part I'm not proud of, felt something close to satisfaction, the ugly kind of feeling that grief sometimes curdles into. But a larger part of me, the part shaped by years of nursing and by whatever remained of the love I'd once felt for my sister, felt only fear. I was not assigned to Isabel's case, and under normal circumstances I would have had no reason to be anywhere near that delivery room. But hospitals are strange, intimate places, and word travels fast through their hallways regardless of who is officially involved. I learned, in fragments passed between colleagues, that the delivery had been complicated by preeclampsia, that both twins were being closely monitored, and that Eleanor Cole had arrived at the hospital and was sitting in the family waiting area, alone, because Gregory was still en route from a job site 2 hours away. Something in me, some instinct I still can't fully explain, pulled me toward that waiting room instead of toward the parking lot and my own exhausted drive home. I found Eleanor sitting in a plastic chair with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She looked up when I entered, and I watched surprise, then something like relief, cross her face. She reached out and took my hand without asking permission, and I let her, because whatever had happened between our families, Eleanor Cole had never been anything but kind to me, and grief, I was learning, does not always follow the tidy lines we draw around who deserves our comfort. We sat together in silence for nearly 20 minutes, two women bound by a betrayal that had happened around us rather than between us, waiting for news about children who would be, by blood, her grandchildren and, by the strange arithmetic of family, something more complicated to me. When the obstetrician finally emerged, she explained that Isabel was stable but would need to remain under observation, and that the twins, a boy and a girl, had been moved to the neonatal intensive care unit as a precaution due to their early arrival, but were breathing on their own and doing reasonably well given the circumstances. Eleanor asked, in a voice that trembled more than I'd ever heard it tremble, if she could see them. Because of my position at the hospital, and because the family was, in the tangled way these things work, still technically mine by association even after the divorce, I was permitted to accompany her to the viewing window outside the NICU. The twins lay in adjacent incubators, small and impossibly fragile, wrapped in blankets too big for their tiny frames, wires and monitors attached to their delicate skin. I felt, looking at them, an emotion I hadn't expected and couldn't fully name, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite tenderness but existed in the complicated space between the two. They were innocent of everything that had brought them into being. Whatever their parents had done, these two small lives hadn't chosen any of it, and some old, deep instinct in me, the same instinct that had drawn me to nursing in the first place, softened at the sight of them despite everything. It was Eleanor who noticed it first. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly, staring at the girl's small exposed shoulder where the blanket had shifted. I watched the color drain from her face so completely and so suddenly that I instinctively reached out to steady her, thinking she might faint. Her hand gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, shaking with something that sounded less like joy and more like fear. She asked me, her eyes never leaving the small mark visible on the infant's shoulder, whether I could see it too, a birthmark shaped like a small crescent, pale red against the baby's skin. When I told her yes, I could see it, she asked me the question that would change the entire direction of this story, the question that gives this story its title, the question I will never forget as long as I live. She asked me, her voice breaking, whether the boy had the same mark, and when a nurse inside the unit gently lifted the boy's blanket to check, revealing an identical crescent-shaped mark on his tiny shoulder, Eleanor made a sound I can only describe as a sob caught halfway between grief and terror, and she gripped my hands and asked me to please find out immediately whether these babies had been tested for a condition called Cole-Hartley syndrome, a rare inherited heart defect that ran silently and devastatingly through her side of the family. I did not know, in that moment, what Cole-Hartley syndrome was, but I knew enough about genetics and enough about the particular terror in Eleanor's voice to understand that this was not an idle concern. I found the attending physician immediately and relayed what Eleanor had told me, and within the hour, a cardiologist had been called in to examine both infants more closely. What Eleanor explained to me, sitting once again in that plastic waiting room chair, her hands no longer folded but trembling openly in her lap, was a piece of family history she had carried alone for nearly 50 years, a secret so heavy that even her own son didn't fully know its weight. Long before Gregory was born, Eleanor had given birth to a son, her firstborn, a boy she and her late husband had named Peter. Peter had seemed healthy at birth, with the same faint crescent-shaped birthmark on his shoulder that Eleanor had always considered nothing more than a pretty, ordinary quirk of pigmentation. He had died at 11 weeks old, suddenly and without warning, and it was only years later, after Gregory was born with the same birthmark and after a cardiologist finally connected the pattern across several branches of the extended Cole family, that Eleanor learned the truth. The birthmark was not incidental. It was a visible marker, present in perhaps 60% of cases, of a rare and dangerous cardiac conduction abnormality that could cause sudden, catastrophic heart failure in infancy if it went undetected and untreated, but which was entirely manageable, even correctable, with early intervention once identified. Gregory himself had been tested as an infant after his brother's death and had been found to carry a mild, non-dangerous variant of the condition, which was why he had grown up under regular cardiac monitoring that had, by adulthood, become routine enough that he rarely mentioned it, even to me, during our 11 years of marriage. It had simply become background noise in his life, a footnote rather than a headline, and I understood now, with a strange and complicated ache, that this was likely part of why the fear of passing on a serious condition to a child of his own had weighed on him more heavily than he'd ever fully admitted, perhaps even more heavily than the more publicly discussed grief over our fertility struggles. None of that excused what he'd done. I want to be clear about that. But grief, I was learning again and again through this entire ordeal, rarely explains itself in simple terms, and people carry fears that shape their choices in ways even they don't fully understand until much later, if ever. The cardiologist's examination, conducted with the urgency that Eleanor's warning demanded, confirmed her fear within hours. Both twins carried a more severe variant of the condition than Gregory's, the kind that, left undetected, could indeed prove fatal in the coming weeks as their small hearts adjusted to life outside the womb. But because the condition had been caught so early, because Eleanor had recognized a birthmark she had spent 50 years both remembering and trying to forget, the medical team was able to begin immediate treatment, a combination of careful monitoring and a minor procedure that, performed early enough, carried an excellent prognosis. The doctor told us, with the particular gravity doctors reserve for moments that matter most, that had this gone unnoticed for even another week or two, the outcome could have been very different. Eleanor's 50-year-old grief, the secret weight of a baby she had lost and never fully spoken of, had become, in this strange and impossible circular way, the very thing that saved her grandchildren's lives. I share all of this with you not because it excuses anything that happened, but because life rarely offers us the clean moral lines we wish it would. In the days that followed, as the twins stabilized and began the slow work of growing stronger, I found myself, almost against my own will, drawn back into the orbit of a family I had sworn to leave behind forever. Isabel, still recovering in her hospital bed, asked to see me on the third day, and though every instinct told me to refuse, I found myself walking down that hallway anyway, propelled by something larger than my own anger, something that felt, though I resisted the word for a long time, like grace. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished not just by the physical toll of a difficult delivery but by something that had clearly been eating at her from the inside for months. When I entered her room, she began to cry before either of us had said a single word, and she told me, in halting, broken sentences, that not a single day had passed in the past 2 years when she hadn't hated herself for what she'd done to me. She said she understood if I could never forgive her, that she didn't even know how to ask for forgiveness for something this large, but that she needed me to know, regardless of whether it changed anything between us, that finding out her children carried a life-threatening condition, and learning that it was my presence in that hospital, my relationship with Eleanor that I had somehow maintained despite everything, that had led to their diagnosis and treatment, had broken something open in her that she couldn't fully explain. She said she didn't deserve my help, and that she would understand if I walked out of that room and never looked back, but that some part of her, watching me stand there anyway, wondered if there was a version of our family that could survive this, even if it looked nothing like what either of us had once imagined. I did not forgive her in that moment. I want to be honest with you about that, because forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not a single dramatic decision made in a hospital room full of emotion and adrenaline. It is a long, slow process, full of setbacks and small progress, much like healing from any serious wound. But I told her, that day, that I was glad the twins would be okay, and that I would think about what came next, and for the first time in 6 months, that felt like enough. It felt like a door left open rather than either slammed shut or thrown wide, and I was learning that sometimes a door left open is the most honest gift you can offer someone who has hurt you beyond words. Gregory and I spoke only once during those weeks in the hospital, a brief and awkward exchange in a hallway where he thanked me, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite categorize, for what I'd done in helping to get the twins diagnosed so quickly. I told him plainly that I hadn't done it for him, and he nodded, accepting that without argument, which was perhaps the first genuinely mature response I'd witnessed from him since the whole ordeal began. He looked older than his years in that hallway, worn down by fear and by the slow realization, I think, of exactly what he had risked and lost through his own choices. I did not offer him forgiveness either, not that day, and I'm not sure, even now, that our relationship has fully healed in the way that mine and Isabel's eventually would. Some betrayals require different timelines to mend, and some relationships, I've come to understand, may simply exist in a permanently altered, more distant form, and that this, too, can be a kind of peace. The months that followed brought slow, unglamorous change, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling but that constitutes the actual texture of real healing. I began visiting the twins, first at the hospital and then, once they were discharged, at Isabel's small apartment, initially only to check on their cardiac follow-up appointments given my medical background, but gradually, almost without my noticing the shift, out of something that felt increasingly like genuine affection. The little girl, whom Isabel had named Margaret after Eleanor's own mother, had a fierce, curious energy about her even in infancy, gripping my finger with surprising strength every time I visited. The boy, named Peter after the uncle he would never meet, was quieter, more watchful, and something about the weight of that name, chosen deliberately by Isabel as a tribute to the family history that had ultimately saved his life, moved me every time I said it aloud. Eleanor and I grew closer during this period in a way I never could have anticipated. She would call me some evenings just to talk, not about the twins or about Gregory or Isabel, but about ordinary things, her garden, a book she was reading, a memory from her own difficult marriage decades ago. I came to understand that Eleanor had spent most of her adult life being strong for everyone around her, absorbing grief and hardship without ever fully processing it herself, and that our unlikely friendship had given her, for the first time in decades, a space to simply be a person rather than a pillar. She told me once, on one of those evening phone calls, that she considered what I had done for those twins the greatest act of grace she had ever witnessed, greater even than she felt she deserved to receive given her own son's choices, and I told her, honestly, that I hadn't done it for grace or for grand moral reasons. I had done it because 2 innocent children needed help, and I happened to be standing there, and something in me simply couldn't walk away. She told me that was exactly what grace looked like in real life, quiet and unglamorous and entirely unconcerned with whether it was deserved. A year passed, and then most of another, and the family that emerged from the wreckage of my marriage looked nothing like the one I had once imagined for myself, but it was not without its own strange beauty. I never remarried Gregory, of course, and I never fully returned to the easy closeness Isabel and I had once shared as children, but we built something new between us, something more honest than what we'd had before, precisely because it had been tested by fire and had survived. I became, in the eyes of the twins as they grew older, something like an aunt, though the actual word for our relationship never quite fit any category that already existed. I was there for Margaret's first steps, taken across Isabel's kitchen floor with the same fierce determination she'd shown as an infant gripping my finger. I was there for Peter's first cardiology checkup that came back entirely clear, no further concerns, a moment that made Eleanor weep openly in the waiting room while I held her hand the same way she had once held mine. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this is the moment in the story where I think the deeper lesson lies, the reason I wanted to share this with you and with our channel in the first place. If this story has touched you at all, if something in it has reminded you of your own capacity for both grief and grace, I'd love for you to leave a comment below and tell me about a time in your own life when forgiveness came slowly, imperfectly, or in a form you never expected. Sometimes the most meaningful healing doesn't look like the clean reconciliation we see in movies. Sometimes it looks like showing up anyway, imperfectly, for people who have hurt us, because some deeper part of us understands that love and hurt are rarely as separable as we wish they were. As for my own life, the years since the divorce have brought their own quiet unfolding. I eventually moved out of the apartment above the bakery and bought a small house of my own, one with a mailbox that hangs perfectly straight, a detail that still makes me smile every time I pull into the driveway, as though some part of me needed that small, stubborn symbol of a life built correctly, on my own terms, after everything. I threw myself further into my nursing career, eventually training to specialize in neonatal cardiac care, a path I might never have discovered had it not been for that terrible, transformative afternoon in the NICU waiting room. I have, in the years since, helped identify early warning signs in several other infants, families who will never know that their child's life was touched, in some indirect and complicated way, by the worst betrayal I ever experienced. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that, the way our deepest wounds can become, if we let them, the very source of our capacity to help others. I did, eventually, find love again, though not in the dramatic, sweeping way stories sometimes promise. His name is Thomas, a pediatric cardiologist I met through the very follow-up appointments that had once been part of my ongoing connection to Isabel's twins. He is patient in a way that reminds me, sometimes, painfully, of the man I once believed Gregory to be, but he has never once given me reason to doubt that patience is anything but genuine. We are not married, not yet, though we've spoken about it in the quiet, unhurried way people speak about futures they've earned the right to trust. What I've learned, through all of this, is that the life I have now was not the life I planned, not the life I grieved when it was taken from me in that first terrible year, but it is, in its own hard-won way, a good life, full of people I love and who have, in their imperfect human ways, tried to love me back. Isabel and I are not what we once were to each other, and I've made peace with that. We share holidays now, careful and a little formal, gathered around Eleanor's table the way we once were before everything broke apart, but there is an honesty between us now that didn't exist before, a willingness to acknowledge the wound rather than pretend it never happened. She has thanked me more times than I can count, and I've stopped deflecting those thanks the way I used to, because I've come to understand that allowing someone to express genuine gratitude is its own small act of grace, one that costs the giver very little but means everything to the person offering it. Gregory and I remain civil, coexisting at family gatherings for the sake of the twins, and though I don't know that I will ever fully understand why he made the choices he made, I've stopped needing that understanding in order to move forward with my own life. The twins are older now, old enough to run through Eleanor's garden shrieking with laughter, old enough to ask, in the innocent and unfiltered way children do, why their Aunt Vivian doesn't live with their father the way other kids' parents do. Isabel and I have agreed, together, on a version of the truth that honors their innocence while still being honest, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love, and that families can look many different shapes and still be full of love, and that the most important thing is that everyone in this particular family loves them fiercely, imperfectly, and completely. I watch them sometimes, chasing each other across Eleanor's lawn in the late afternoon sun, and I think about that terrible day in the hospital waiting room, about Eleanor's hand gripping my arm hard enough to bruise, about the crescent-shaped birthmark that turned out to be, in the strangest possible way, both a warning and a gift. I think about how close we came to losing them, and about how the very worst chapter of my life became, through some alchemy I still don't fully understand, the thing that led me to save them. If you have made it this far in this story, I want to thank you, genuinely, for sitting with me through all of it, the betrayal and the grief and the long, slow work of rebuilding something honest out of the wreckage. Before I close, I want to ask you once more to leave a comment below and share what this story meant to you, particularly if you've ever had to find forgiveness for someone who hurt you in ways you never thought you'd survive, or if you've ever discovered unexpected strength in the middle of your own worst moment. Your comments mean more to this community than you know, and reading them reminds all of us that we are not alone in carrying these complicated, human stories. Betrayal has a way of convincing you that your story is over, that whatever comes next will only ever be a diminished version of the life you once had. I am here to tell you, from the other side of that particular darkness, that this is a lie, one of the cruelest lies grief tells us. My story did not end in that hospital waiting room, or in that kitchen where I asked my husband to leave, or in the 6 lonely months that followed. It kept going, in ways I never could have predicted, toward a life that holds more complexity and more hard-won wisdom than the simpler life I once imagined for myself, but also, somehow, more genuine love. I did not choose the betrayal that reshaped my life. But I did choose, again and again, in small unglamorous moments that rarely felt heroic while I was living them, to keep showing up, to keep offering grace even when it wasn't asked for correctly or deserved cleanly, and to keep believing that the people who hurt us are still capable, sometimes, of becoming better than the worst thing they ever did. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own thoughts or experiences, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder that second chances are possible even after the deepest betrayals, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one of these emotional journeys. Our channel exists because of stories like this one, and because of a community of people, like you, who still believe that kindness and forgiveness are worth choosing, again and again, even when they are hard, even when they are not immediately rewarded, even when the path toward them is long and uncertain. Thank you for walking this story with me. Thank you for believing, even in a small way, that healing is possible. And thank you, most of all, for being exactly the kind of person who understands that grace, real grace, is rarely convenient, but it is always, in the end, worth it.